the theme today is to look a little more inwards. Chris talked about the broader construct of what's happening in semiconductors. In the next 40, 50 odd minutes, I'm hoping through the stellar panel that we have today, we'll look at some elements of, we'll look inwards and see what are the elements and challenges that face us as we start building a more robust semiconductor value chain in the country. And I think of semiconductor value chain, obviously, we're talking about design, we're talking about R&D, we're talking about research, materials, we're going to talk about manufacturing, front-end, back-end, and of course, the whole distribution and value chain. So, fairly broad-based topic. We'll try to cover as much as we can. Thankfully, we have a stellar panel that will cover specific elements of these value chain. So with that, I want to start off with Dr. Rao first, an academician of great pedigree. Dr. Rao, you and I have spoken about this many times in the past. India is the engineering hub for design, chip design, but there is this constant reminder about research being not deep enough, and how does the elements of policy, talent, curriculum, what can academia do, how can industries participate, no better than you to kind of talk to the broader elements of how do we make semiconductor engineering research more fashionable, more relevant, and ready for the big boost we expect to see in the next decade or so.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and for putting me on this panel. Very happy to be here. I think if you talk about the semiconductor research in India, right? India is actually doing very well. Not many are aware of that. Recently, we did a survey. We looked at the top journals which are dedicated for semiconductor research. One of them is IEEE Transactions on Electron Devices. And if you look at the publications in electron devices area in that particular journal, India ranks third. China number 1, US number 2, India number 3. Not Japan, not Europe, not any other country. So that is a lot of good research is happening there. We also have presence in some of the major conferences and all that. And if you look at the sensors research, right, I believe that sensors is one area where India can really India needs to leapfrog. I mean, India needs lots of IoT kind of systems with embedded sensors, whether you talk about agriculture or security or healthcare, anything you take, sensors are going to be the future. The sensors market alone is like $1 trillion. That's what all predictions show now. The IoT market almost like $1 trillion by 2032. And India again does very well in the sensors research, right? India ranks second right now. If you again look at some of these journals dedicated to sensors research, India ranks second, only behind China. US comes third, right? So a lot of good research is happening right now. I mean, it's not that we are writing papers and nobody is reading them. Even if you look at the citations, India does very well in the top 10 countries. While there is so much of research happening in the semiconductors area, in the IoT area, in the sensors area, why is it that we still don't have a semiconductor fab or anything like that? I mean, these are historical policy and all of are the reasons. But if you talk about research, the ecosystem exists. Ministry of Electronics particularly has invested in 7 institutions in the country, with a funding of about 300 to 400 crores per institute. Almost like 1500 crores of funding has gone into establishing what is known as Centers of Excellence for Nanoelectronics. Started way back in 2006 at IIT Bombay, where I was the lead PI for that project. Then IIT Delhi and many IITs, and now BITS Pilani is also covered in that. So I think among all of these research centers too, lot of good research is happening right now. But the problem with Indian research is, most of our research is focused on publishing papers. We think that a project is over once a paper is published. Now, we are not connected with the industry. As a result, not much of this research, finds its way into products and other things. And because of the lack of industry, academia collaborations in the country, particularly concerning the semiconductor research, though a lot of research happens, but industry, doesn't seem to be aware of what's happening much. And much of this research that we do in India is also with the parent companies in the US. I did a lot of projects for Intel, but most of those projects were Intel in the Portland group, funded by them and mentored by them, things like that. So we're not connected very well with the local semiconductor hubs because most of them are focused on VLSI design. In the VLSI design, India is doing very well. And I think a lot of research that way is happening. My only thing is more system-oriented research is what is required. Research that leads to building complete systems. Because if you are able to build those systems, then we can start companies and we can take things to the next level through the startup and other things, which is not as much as what I would have liked to. But if you just talk about understanding research, even fabricating devices, many people ask me, if semiconductor foundry comes in India, do we have sufficient manpower? I can tell you in TSMC in Taiwan, right, there are so many Indians right now working in advanced manufacturing. They are all willing to come back to India. In fact, they all play cricket there. They are the only ones who play cricket in Taiwan. And if the day there is a foundry in India, I can tell you a lot of them are willing to come back. And even in the US, right, Intel and any place you go, I mean, when there was a saying some time ago that IC is what? IC is Indians and Chinese. The Chinese may include Taiwanese also. But I think, if India starts a foundry, the manpower, the talent is least of our worries. And there are enough people working at the cutting edge of this research. I think India can pick up all of that. I think it's more to do with policies and other things, but least to worry about when it comes to talent and some of those kind of aspects.
Wonderful, thank you. And in fact, I'm reminded of what Chris just said, right? The best way to build a fab skill is to build a fab. The way we built our engineering talent was to have a lot of the multinationals come and set up development centers. Obviously, it became a career for engineering graduates, and one thing led to another. And the other interesting takeaway, Dr. Rao, was the traditional compute store network paradigm. You got to pick the right part of the value chain to make sure that the research translates to more material outcomes, not just a research paper or a patent or a disclosure. Very important, but something more than that. So slightly changing gears, I'm looking at you, Ravi. We talked about the elements of value chain, an element that we don't often talk about enough, but superbly important in the whole supply chain is all the materials that comes into the manufacturing value chain. So among the very few companies in India, with a footprint in India doing this, so maybe talk a little about what you do and more importantly about how ready are we from a supply chain standpoint. I can say this with a little bit of pride. Micron is one of the first semiconductor major to set up a back-end fab in India, and it looks like we are working together. But just talk to that part of the value chain and what challenges and opportunities you see there.
Sure. The history of the company goes back more than 300 years. In India, we were established as a manufacturing multinational 92 years ago. So we've been manufacturing in India for 92 years. We started with smelting. Of course, electronics didn't exist at that time. And then we've evolved and we've helped actually build the electronics industry in India. We operate in 50 countries. I guess the unique portion of what we end up doing is we go from chip to box, from back end of line semiconductor interconnects, all the way down to finished products, box build. And we have technologies and portfolios that cover that entire chain. So, we, as far as our infrastructure here is concerned, we've sort of evolved with the industry here, which is that we started with supporting final assembly, then we started with supporting printed circuit board assembly, then PC printed circuit fab, and now we're starting to look at packaging with OSATs. So along the way, I mean, the technology we are a very technology-rich company globally, and the management philosophy is that if there is a business case we can actually do it, right? So there's no real barrier as long as the business case is there. I think as far as your second part of your question was, the infrastructure. So we have right now 2 manufacturing facilities in India, including in Chennai, and we have our global R&D center in Bangalore, which we established in almost 18, 19 years ago here. There is a lot of work to be done in building up the materials manufacturing ecosystem and do it very systematically as you go along, and maybe leverage the capabilities that already exist here and co-opt those capabilities to sort of move to the next level. That definitely needs to be done, and it is actually being done. It's being mapped out, and as we speak, starting. I mean, the most logical thing is we've got about, including you guys coming here with packaging. There's probably, I can count 8 or so, 7 other OSAT facilities that are in various stages. So starting with that, I think building the domestic capability for manufacturing the materials would be a good thing to start. And simultaneously looking at what the roadmap is to support a fab when it actually comes. And one needs to look at it in the global context that, we are a global company. We can bring technology from anywhere. And so I don't see that as a barrier, so to speak. I would say that what will drive the localization of production is the business justification. If there's money that can be made domestically with the capex and investments that need to be made, it'll happen.
Awesome, wonderful. Actually, Ravi, two things caught my attention as you were saying, right? One was just a trigger on the concept of packaging, right? Many of us who've been in semiconductors, we have the challenges of physics and Moore's law and manifestation of that, making things difficult to make chips smaller and smaller. And a lot more innovation is happening in the packaging space, where we're trying to see how we can have more bandwidth come through innovative packaging, be that be what we call high bandwidth memory manufacturing in our world. And a lot of that is based on input elements on the substrate and packaging elements. So clearly a great sector to go after, because India seems to have gotten more wave of advanced packaging and OSAT-like manufacturing coming to the country initially, while the fab aspiration continues to stay, though Chris would recommend that we don't bother too much about fab. Thank you, Ravi. Appreciate your early comments. Raja, I'm looking at you as someone who's done a successful semiconductor startups. You and I were having a fascinating discussion around, should India go all multinational in terms of footprint, or should we also have the ability and the intent to build more SMEs, MSME type infrastructure? So love to know your thoughts on this topic.
Okay. So I'll be speaking mostly on behalf of small companies and medium-sized companies. So if you look at historically, right, there are 2 models of how the semiconductor business has evolved, right? One is the multinational model. Right? Most companies are American or European. They have their corporate, like what Chris has said, right? It's in California. They do all the research and all that, and that's where, very wealthy companies, tens of billions of dollars. And then they have manufacturing all over the world where they find the cheapest possible, and design all over the world, again, is a cost arbitrage to find the cheaper design source, right? So that's one model. And countries like Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, they have kind of adopted to being service providers to these guys, right? So that's one model. The other model to me is a Taiwan model, right? Taiwan is a indigenous, self-growth, innovative companies that are Taiwanese, right? Or similar to the Korean story, right? If you look at Korea, right, it's Samsung or LG or SK Hynix and so on, right? And one thing that is very obvious, right? If you look at, none of these American or European companies have very big manufacturing in these countries. They use them, but they themselves do not have any, big footprint in manufacturing. I used to be a TI guy, right? TI had a facility, a manufacturing facility in Taiwan, which is now probably gone down to almost nothing from a manufacturing standpoint. They had fabs in Japan. There's no more, TI fabs in Japan anymore. Or they may have some very small. They did not expand. But they expanded in other places, right, where there was some cost arbitrage and so forth. So we have to decide as a country which path best suits us based on our talent, our strengths in this. So if you map that and say, like what Professor was saying, right, there's tons of research being done. on MEMS or sensors. So can we build a world-class sensors company out of India? So you focus on certain niches and say, look, this is our strength, and take that and create indigenous companies out of it. And this is where the policies of the government and so on can come in and fit together and say, look, I'm going to invest $100 million on this very passionate guys who are going to build this sensor company. So I'm an ex-TI guy, and I'm a big fan of Maurice Chang, who built TSMC. They took a bet on him, right? He had all the the background. He was a fab guy. He had some business acumen. He had the connections. I mean, he was a very, very deep tech guy in TI. So they bet on him, and guess what? 30, 40, 50 years later, right? Taiwan has become a powerhouse in this. So I think we have to decide. Now we are in 2024. Obviously, there could be a hybrid model where we support both the MNCs as well as the local indigenous companies. My concern is what I'm seeing so far is there is less of a support in this homegrown support, right? That these guys really need. Because I guess there was somebody asked this question just now to Chris. They're struggling. They have designs, but they can't productize. So one of the things that can happen is, for example, the Tamil Nadu government can say, okay, I will guarantee you come to Tamil Nadu, you design in Tamil Nadu, I will guarantee you silicon validation. So as a government right now, they have a little bit more clout in this, right? They could go to TSMC or UMC and say, look, I'm willing to pay $20, $30 million, right? Take or pay. And say that, look, I have enough guys that, you do, give me shuttles, give me this, give me that, so they could be a conduit, right? Put together some guys. So those are the kind of subsidies that are really, really required. And then bang on some of these, bigger goals of, pick one, right? Could be sensors, could be MEMS, could be some, power semiconductor and so forth. So that's one area I believe, right, where I think we can excel and start this process. I believe 5 years, 10 years from now, we could be on a path to creating a TI in India or a MediaTek in India. But India has to have a plan. The other thing is, huge amount of subsidies are given to EMS companies, semiconductor companies, both from the central government, and each state is fighting with each other to give more. So it's never heard of, by the way. 70%, 80% of CapEx is funded by government. No other government in the world, I think, gives that. Not even in the US. But we give it. And guess what? Where all this money goes? It goes to all the equipment that is not made in India. So all these subsidies actually going abroad again, right? So again, right, you give the money, that's fine, because there's no choice, right? There's no equipment makers here. But you create a path that 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I need to have at least 30% of the equipment made here. It's not a bad ask, right? Because they are basically giving the money for you to free. So you come out with a plan, right? So I think, all these combinations of working together and every, whether it's Chris Miller or anyone else, right? We always talk about talent and is there a market? We have everything. We have talent, we have market. But I think finally is a politics. The politics of where these big companies would like to invest. So if we're chasing the big companies to come and invest, it's purely political in my mind. But if it is really, we want to grow and we want to become big contributors in the semiconductor globally, I think, and as the semiconductor market is going to double from 450 to 900 or a trillion, I think there will be new companies that need to come out of India, which will become sizable in the next 5 to 10 years. So I think the value proposition that I'm saying is, invest in the SMEs and MSMEs and, guys who have got potential.
No, agree. And I think Raja makes a very good point because I think India always does things its own way. So probably the hybrid is my guess, will approach, because when I look at the semiconductor engineering talent, we all owe a gratitude to TI that started its operation in the late 80s, early 90s, because many of my own best engineers are essentially a downstream from that operation. And if you look at the dish tech, fintech, digital world, Flipkart, ex-Flipkarts are the ones who are running a lot of the startups in those spaces, right? So clearly you need some big pivot to help you train talent, get you to scale, and then the downstream provisioning has to be done so that we are not just MNC driven, but we have indigenous players come in, and government has to have policy and incentives to back that. So wonderful. Another pivot now, Sudarshan. You've set up engineering R&D operations. You and I were chatting about how hard it is to find mixed signal analog guys, talk of TI. So tell us about, of course, we're all assuming the talent is easy, available. Tell us a little more about how true that is, what has been your journey, and what has worked and not worked.
So I'll make it a Chennai or Tamil Nadu context,
Okay,
sure. To make it a little more interesting. It's very different from Bangalore. In fact, I'll, connecting some of the dots, it's finding talent and bringing companies is the easy part if there is the government backing to say this is what we want to do. I'll put that in perspective. Qualcomm's first R&D center in India was actually put up in Chennai, but it was closed down a year later, and 2 years after that they built it up in Hyderabad, and rest is history. So it is an indicator of, yes, there is talent visibility in Tamil Nadu everywhere. Bangalore, half the talent pool in Bangalore is actually from Tamil Nadu alone. What are the things that make it a little different here? One, I think if colleges are listening, I'd say, or even parents, I'd say, willingness to communicate is more important than the communication itself. Inculcate the idea of willingness to communicate. Language isn't a barrier. There is plenty of talent in Tamil Nadu. All the talent that transports itself into Bangalore are the ones that are able to communicate. The willingness to communicate is limited in many. That we need to improve. But the pure engineering talent, I've hired for large companies like Qualcomm and now with MaxLinear, and I've done for my own startup at Cubercom. Whether there is tier 1 colleges or tier 2, tier 3s. I've hired for my startup entirely from tier 2 to tier 3 colleges in southern Tamil Nadu. And I've had phenomenal success out of that if I was willing and able to coach them how to communicate. Because almost entirely all of them failed my interviews that I would typically do for a Qualcomm. Almost entirely all of them. I took a chance and said, okay, I have to hire interns and train them. And then I find out, oh, it's actually, there is talent in there. They're just not willing to communicate. I'll put a small example. When you ask somebody in Bangalore and say, hey, you were supposed to deliver this task on this date, are you on track? And the guy will give you a story. And here in Chennai, or in any part of Tamil Nadu, the guy will say yes or no. Then you will have to keep pulling answers out of them. And I have been able to hire and I actually had set up satellite offices in Trichy and in Coimbatore for a small startup in itself. And there is plenty of talent. I never had any difficulty finding talent if I was willing to figure out what their gaps are and coach them, and vast majority of it is in the enabling them to communicate. When that happens, the rest follows. Yes, there are niche areas where there is talent gaps. Analog mixed signal is one area where across the globe it's a challenge, and India is no different because it is harder. The harder things to do, there's going to be fewer people wanting to do, but that's where perhaps Chennaites, Tamilians can make a difference. We are used to doing things the hard way and doing the harder things. Let's go after it, do it. Build a talent pool here. Analog and mixed signal talent is going to be in need forever. It ain't going away anywhere. So, invest in some things. Like Raja was saying, we have to figure out what we want to invest in. There are many avenues. If we are going to go chase after MNCs, large MNCs to come set up stuff in Tamil Nadu, I think there's too much competition for it. And to be brutally honest, Bangalore and Hyderabad have a leg up on many of those domains, right? But mid-tier companies and startups who need the talent, who can bring the talent, but when they go to Bangalore, that talent walks out the door within a few months. It's a revolving door for them. Create a niche for those types of companies, the mid-tier and the small startups. If you create an environment that is conducive to enable these mid-tier and small companies, Tamil Nadu will go a long way in the semiconductor segment, whether it is on the manufacturing side of things or anywhere up the value chain on the design aspects. We just have to decide what we want to do and go after doing it and enable the startups and mid-tiers to do it. Incentivizing large companies, every state in the country is doing and is going to do. We are no different. We are just going to have to be one of the many. We are better off. There's plenty more mid-tier companies and small companies. Let's enable them. That's what my pitch to anybody from the Tamil Nadu government or otherwise that are interested in listening to this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sudarshan. I think well said. I think all of us have stories of, in fact, I have a short story and I'll keep it really short. 3 years back, we are in the memory space. India doesn't have a natural talent pool for DRAM design, right? We don't really have anyone that has done a DRAM end-to-end design from die, from architecture to silicon. And then, so we stuck our neck out and we hired a bunch of new college grads from multiple colleges in India, including tier 2 and tier 3, as you rightly said. Gave them the soft skills and cultural skills to go work in Japan because that was our primary operating partner. And lo and behold, and I'm so proud of this, 3 years down the line, we have, in the history of Micron that makes memory for a living, having a DRAM die come out with zero reticle revision, first silicon pass, yielding to high volume manufacturing at predictable scale was a validation of the fact that you have the raw material to go work with. You've got to figure out how to process it appropriately. You talked about soft skills, language, communication, also cultural integration, because there'll always be a partner you got to partner with. We live in a very collaborative world. Sometimes I worry that we become too country-specific. It's like, of course, India has to win. It's a safe assumption to make for a proud Indian. But it's such a connected world in semiconductors. You're not going to win at the expense of someone else, but working with someone else. It could be Taiwan, it could be Singapore, it could be US. And that spirit cannot be broken because otherwise you will end up being too insular while watching out for your own stuff. So I think, I hope you got a sense of, I just had one quick question for all the panelists before we jump into Q&A. The India Semiconductor Mission was announced a couple of years back. We had financial incentives. We have seen some early results. It's a work in progress. But if each one of us had to go back and talk to the government, assuming they listen to us, and talk about what could be done differently and or what is going on well and keep doing it, and I'll not go through any sequence here. Anything that comes to mind from either from a policy, incentive, strategy, or focus standpoint. I think we've covered some of it in your opening comments, but if in case you missed out on any of it, any one of you.
I'd like to say a little bit on the policy thing. I think one thing the semiconductor people can learn from is from the automotive industry. If you look at India, right, 30 years ago, India was manufacturing something like 4,000 cars. Today, India manufactures over 30 million cars, right? And the automobile component manufacturing last year turnover was 70 billion US dollars. And our cars are getting exported, our parts are getting exported to 150 countries. India was not a player in automotive sector 30 years ago. All of that happened, to a very strategic kind of a plan, the Maruti Suzuki kind of a model. Even for semiconductors, I think we need to learn from the automotive sector, which is a huge success in India, and draw upon those strengths, a joint venture kind of a model. Maruti Suzuki sort of a model, innovating for India, which is very important. Otherwise, a chip which TSMC is manufacturing, doing it in India, I don't think, it's going to make a big hell of a difference for anybody. But now that if you have a manufacturing happening in India, if you customize to the Indian needs, the multinationals are only meeting maybe 100 million of India's 1.4 billion population. I think, innovating for India, whether it is agriculture, healthcare, security. I think some of these areas through the semiconductor manufacturing is, in my opinion, something that we can learn from the automotive sector. And also secondly about, the people, the talent, since I come from the academia, often this is a question. I was part of the national committee for developing talent pool for the Indian semiconductor mission. And it was actually, very interesting. We had a lot of people from industries on the panel. If running a fab of 30,000 wafers per month takes about 1800 people, 1850 people exactly. That's what, out of which operators are about 500 with ITI kind of background, 450 with diploma background, BE, ME 900 people, ME, PhD 150 people. That's all what it takes today to run a fab, right? And if you compare it with the India's talent pool that exists today, we have 2 million students pursuing bachelor's degrees in engineering in just electrical, electronics and CS, right? So 2 million people, and we have 350,000 students doing masters in semiconductor areas. We have PhDs, 28,000 PhDs. So I think, when it comes to talent, a little bit of orientation is all what is required. But for me, semiconductor mission doesn't mean whatever is happening elsewhere, you do it in India. For me, semiconductor mission means innovating for India, exactly like what the automotive sector has done. I think meeting the Indian needs and, developing further markets and further market penetration into the unaddressed kind of sectors, that currently is an issue. So that is what, to me, the semiconductor manufacturing is.
No, excellent, excellent insights. Raja, Ravi, any thoughts?
No, I think the focus on packaging as a natural bridge
Right.
from between assembly and fab is a good one, because it is very possible to do that with less capex. It's not a stretch to execute. So the focus on packaging, I think, is really good, and probably we need to do more of that. The second thing which ISM is also doing is to also look at power semiconductor and look at compound semi, either gallium nitride, silicon carbide, but also silicon based, and sort of build that entire ecosystem, because there is so much need for that. Like Dr. Rao mentioned, I mean, looking at what the requirements are locally and building around that. I think sensors, I totally agree, but aside from that, power semi and building the entire power semi ecosystem and systems is going to be critical. So I would really do more of that as well. The third thing that I would say is a much greater focus on research. And I don't mean simply the multinational research. I'm talking about across the board. The percentage of revenue that needs to be put into R&D in this industry is huge, and we need to get companies, government, as well as universities in that mindset and frame of reference to, and it's beginning to happen. I mean, there is a consortium of 12 IITs and ISC and a lot of industry players coming together to build up the packaging research capability, but I think we need to do a lot more of that, I would say, across the board.
Great, great.
One thing that I would say till the governments would be, hey, I've run a startup in Chennai, but whatever it is the policies are, how can we make it more visible, more obvious, more accessible, right? Whatever the incentives may be. How can somebody, not have to run through a lot of red tape before figuring out what it is that is available? How do you get access to it, right? Those things. I think enabling that, if the governments can do what they actually want to do, if they can make it easier for companies to leverage it, that is something that will differentiate Tamil Nadu from other places, is my opinion.
Just one comment there, Sudarshan. I think someone in the audience mentioned about the product market fit challenge that we have in startups, right? I think it's a genuine challenge because we just acquired an Indian startup, and what we realized was the the venture capital community wants you to focus on larger markets for margin reasons, right? Because the Indian market is generally considered to be value conscious, not paying you the premium for the technology. I'm not saying I agree to it, but that's the perception. So you tend to focus on external markets. You don't have people with that knowledge. The people who generally come back to the country are largely engineering people who come back and other professionals, but not necessarily a VP of marketing, is what I think you mentioned or someone, right? And that's a gap. And then that is what is preventing some of the Indian startups from not getting the scale, semiconductor startups from getting the scale. And just the DLI is a good start, giving you incentives to go through the first 9, 12 months of silicon tape out phase, but more importantly, getting the product market fit going. So very important. Raja, you would have some context there, right? So
Yeah, of course.
a lot of context.
No, I think, see, it's a demand creation, right? If you look at the China model, right, Huawei exists because the end China telecom companies supported Huawei. And Huawei, in turn, built up HiSilicon internally, right? HiSilicon is a multi-billion-dollar business. Initially, it was just supporting Huawei. But then later on, right now, they started selling the chips to external as well. So one approach is, we have the demand, right? Let's take solar, for example, right? There is an aspiration to do 50 to 70 gigawatt per year for the next 10 years or so, right? That's a huge, huge demand, right? Most countries would be happy to do 5, for example, right? So we're talking about a scale. Now, there's a lot of electronics that goes behind that, right? Where does all that electronics come from today, right? You map it out and you say, okay, am I going to create, is there a possibility for the Indian companies to come in, Indian companies with Indian talent, with the revenue staying in India? So the policies or the governments can enable that. Right? So use the demand side of things and the expertise, that is what Prof is saying. You match that together and say, okay, we pick this 2, 3 areas, right, for the next 5 years, and we indigenize along that and see what are the government policies that can enable that, right? Tata is putting a huge amount of solar near Trichy and so forth, right? There's a lot of electronics that goes behind it. And there's a lot of incentive Tata gets for doing that as well. So can that also go deeper, right? You peel the onion and go deeper and say, okay, some of these components now need to come in, because that's where the crux of it is. The other thing is on the equipment, right? A lot of money goes into the automation and the equipment, right? Because let's say you want to put a solar panel together, right? There's a lot of automation that happens. And, it's not really rockets. I mean, it could be built over time, right? It's not, almost all of this automation equipment now comes from China. Is there an opportunity for us? Are we good at making these kind of things? Coimbatore is a very classic case. They're tool makers for ages. Why can't we do a India Machines Park in Coimbatore, and that will become, a hub for the entire country, right? Because they are the best tool makers. So I think things like that, where you strategize and get the government backing for it, because like the gentleman was saying, he's a small company, right? He can do all the design, but he needs to take it to productization, proof of concept, and then his marketing and all those things, right? Which he doesn't have the bandwidth, the money, or the skills for doing that. That's where the policies and the governments, right? They take a very nuanced approach, not just a general approach. Hey, you come here, I will give you 30%, 20%. Every state is saying that. But use our strengths in the state and guide policies, bet on some of these people. You vet them, right? You vet them. Are they serious? Do they know what they're talking about? Create a panel that you can vet them as well. But it's like what Chris was saying, it's a 10, 20, 30-year project. But we got to start. So I think that would be my recommendation.
Great, thank you, Raja. I think I'm getting enough signals that we have to probably stop it here. So if I had to do a quick summary, I think all of us have kind of spoken to
She's
on a
saying
largely.
questions too.
We'll take some questions. Oh, okay. So I'll still summarize, and then we'll open up for questions, right? So I think the quick summary is we're all optimistic about the future of semiconductors in India. I think that's a safe thing to say, depending on which part of the equation we come from. The fact I can tell you is every state government is holding summits, and semiconductor is a natural part of that agenda, tells you how keen and interested they are. We don't have all the answers, but hopefully between all of us, our intent, the policies, and the talent will help us get to the other side of the fence. So with that, we'll open up for a few questions. So I don't know. Anyone? Yeah, we see a gentleman in the back.
See, sir, as a semiconductor professional, I would like to get this direction for Tamil Nadu. See, is it better to have Anna University is our live wire. We have 600 colleges, students from there. Is it better to have a course dedicated to semiconductor, or since we need electrical, electronic production, all engine students to jump into this kind of field, a kind of a refresher course or a 3 months course for them, which they can take over the 4 years so that they can understand what it is and then can be a very good workforce, which will be a better model for Anna University.
That's a good point you raised. In fact, if you look at India, electronics programs, if you see, 90% of electronics programs have electronics and communication. Why communication? Why not semiconductors? So who said that every electronics must be associated with communications? I think that is the kind of a mindset change that we require. As part of the national committee, there is also a curriculum design now for semiconductor programs, a minor degree program offered to BTech students, right? That's the first thing that we should be doing. And from a minor degree program, then slowly move to the semiconductor kind of, electronics and semiconductor technologies kind of a thing. But don't overdo that. In this country, the problem is we start with a problem and then our solution itself becomes a problem. Because then we produce so many graduates with semiconductors and then, now where are the jobs and all of that. I think if you gradually plan and do things with a right kind of assumptions, things will actually be quite okay. So.
Thank you, sir.
Always good to have the professor say the last final thing. So that will finish the session. Thank you, everyone. And if you have more questions, we can probably catch up later. Thank you.
Yes, can we give them a nice big round of applause?